Before we begin, I want you to consider a question that appears simple but becomes increasingly difficult the more we think about it. Is it possible to do the right thing for the wrong reason? And if it is, then what becomes of that action? Does it remain right, or does it lose its value entirely? T.S. Eliot's Murder in the Cathedral is built around this question, and it does not offer an easy answer. Instead, it takes us into the mind of a man who is preparing to face death, not as a victim, not as a hero, but as someone who must first confront a far more unsettling possibility, that even his willingness to die for God may be shaped by pride, by ambition, or by the desire to be remembered. What we are about to explore, therefore, is not a simple historical event, but a meditation on human intention and on the difficulty of understanding our own motives, even when we believe ourselves to be acting with complete sincerity. Welcome everyone. Today we are going to spend some time with Murder in the Cathedral, but not in the sense in which one usually studies a text for examination purposes, moving quickly from theme to theme or summarizing the plot. Because if we approach this play in that way, we will miss what makes it so distinctive, so unsettling, and so intellectually demanding. What T.S. Eliot has constructed here is not simply a historical drama about the murder of Thomas Becket in the year 1170, nor is it merely a religious play that celebrates martyrdom, but something far more complex, namely, a sustained meditation on the nature of human action, and more specifically on the question of whether it is possible to act rightly without being influenced even in the most subtle way by the desire for personal satisfaction, recognition, or power. This question may seem abstract at first, but Eliot insists on bringing it very close to us, because the play repeatedly draws our attention away from what is visible and external and towards what is internal and often hidden. It asks us not only to consider what Becket does, but why he does it, and even more importantly, whether he himself fully understands why he does it. And as we begin to follow this line of thought, we gradually realize that the problem is not confined to Becket, but extends to all human action, because it raises the uncomfortable possibility that we may not fully understand our own motives, that even when we believe ourselves to be acting selflessly, there may be elements of self-interest that remain concealed from us. In order to understand how Eliot develops this problem, we must begin with the historical framework. Not because Eliot is interested in giving us a detailed historical reconstruction, but because the conflict between Thomas Becket and Henry II provides a structure within which these questions can be explored. Medieval society was organized around two formats of authority that both claimed divine legitimacy. On the one hand, there was the authority of the king, which governed the temporal world, the visible world of law, order, taxation, punishment, and political administration. On the other hand, there was the authority of the church, which governed the spiritual world, the invisible world of sin, salvation, and the eternal destiny of the soul. These two forms of authority were not necessarily opposed to each other, but they were distinct, and their coexistence required a delicate balance. The problem arose when this balance was disturbed, when the boundaries between these two spheres became unclear. Henry II, in his effort to strengthen royal authority and to create a consistent system of justice, sought to bring members of the clergy who were accused of crimes under the jurisdiction of royal courts. From a modern perspective, this might appear as a reasonable reform, an attempt to ensure equality before the law. However, within the medieval framework, it was understood differently. because the clergy were not seen merely as members of society, but as individuals set apart for religious service and therefore accountable primarily to the church. This difference in perspective is crucial because it means that what appears as justice from one point of view appears as sacrilege from another. The conflict between Henry and Becket is therefore not simply a personal disagreement, but a manifestation of a deeper tension between two ways of understanding authority and two ways of understanding the relationship between the human and the divine. Thomas Becket, as Eliot presents him, is not a figure who stands outside the tension from the beginning. On the contrary, he is deeply embedded within the structures of power. As Chancellor, he is the king's close friend and advisor, a man who participates fully in the political life of the court. He enjoys wealth, influence, and authority, and there is no indication that he is dissatisfied with this position. When he is appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, the expectation is that he will continue to serve the king's interests, that he will be the bringer of authority of the church into the alignment with the authority of the crown. What follows, however, is a transformation. And Eliot's treatment of this transformation is significant because he does not attempt to explain it. He does not provide a psychological account of Becket's change, nor does he present it as a sudden moment of revelation. Instead, he allows it to remain unexplained, and this absence of explanation shifts our attention away from the question of why Becket changes and towards the question of what that change demands of him. This is an important shift because it means that the play is not concerned with Becket's past, but with his present condition, with the position in which he finds himself now, and with the choices that he must make. By the time the play begins, Becket has already been in exile for 7 years, and his return to Canterbury is not presented as a strategic move, but as something that carries a sense of inevitability. There is a feeling from the very beginning that events are already in motion, and something has been set in place, and that what is to come cannot easily be avoided. Before Becket himself appears, Eliot introduces the chorus, the women of Canterbury, and it is through their voices that we first encounter the world of the play. The chorus does not speak with authority or clarity. It speaks with uncertainty, with fear, with a sense of apprehension that is difficult to articulate but impossible to ignore. These women are not concerned with abstract principles of theological arguments. They are concerned with survival, with the maintenance of a fragile stability, with the avoidance of suffering. When they describe themselves as living partly, they articulate a condition that is at once ordinary and deeply revealing. To live and partly live is to exist without fully engaging with life, to move through the routines of existence without confronting the deeper demands that life might make upon us. It is to accept suffering because it is familiar, rather than to risk change, which is uncertain. This condition is not presented as a moral failure, but as a human tendency, and it is important to recognize that Eliot does not judge the chorus. Instead, he allows us to see ourselves in them, to recognize in their fear something that is not entirely foreign to our own experience. The language of the chorus reinforces this sense of unease. They speak not in abstract terms, but in sensory images. They describe the air as heavy, as oppressive, as if it carries within it the presence of something that cannot be seen but can be felt. They speak of the smell of death, of a kind of foreboding that permeates their environment. These images create an atmosphere in which the tragedy of the play is not something that will happen in the future, but something that is already present, already unfolding at a level that precedes conscious understanding. When Becket enters, he is immediately distinguished from the chorus, not only by the way he says, but by the way in which he says it. He does not express fear, nor does he attempt to reassure the chorus in a conventional way. Instead, he speaks in terms that suggest acceptance and even a kind of detachment from the immediate situation. He introduces the image of the wheel, an image that is central to the play and which requires careful attention. The world, according to Becket, is like a wheel that is constantly in motion. It is characterized by change, by conflict, by instability. Events rise and fall. Fortunes shift, and nothing remains fixed. However, at the center of this movement, there exists a point that does not move, a point of stillness. This still point is not outside the wheel. It is at its center. It is the point around which everything turns, and yet it does not participate in the turning, in the movement. Becket's aim is to align himself with this still point, to act not in response to the movement of the world, but in accordance with something that remains unchanged. This aspiration immediately raises a difficulty, because action, as we ordinarily understand it, is directed towards outcomes. We act in order to achieve something, to produce a result. If one attempts to act without being concerned with outcomes, then the nature of action itself becomes uncertain. It is at that point that the internal conflict of the play begins to emerge. And Eliot dramatizes this conflict through the sequence of the four tempters. They reveal themselves in different ways in which action can be motivated. Each tempter represents a different possibility, a different way in which Becket might understand his role. When we come to the episode of the tempters in the murder in the cathedral, it is important to recognize that Eliot is not inventing an entirely new structure, but drawing upon a deeply established biblical pattern, most notably the temptations of Christ in the wilderness, as narrated in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. In that narrative, Christ is confronted with a series of temptations that correspond to different forms of power and desire, and each temptation is rejected, not through physical resistance, but through an appeal to a higher principle. Eliot adopts this structure, but he also modifies it in a crucial way, and it is in this modification that the originality of the play becomes apparent. In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 4, Christ is tempted in three distinct ways. First, he is asked to turn stones into bread, a temptation that appeals to physical need and comfort. Second, he is offered the kingdoms of the world, a temptation that appeals to power and dominion. Third, he is invited to throw himself from the pinnacle of the temple, a temptation that appeals to spiritual pride, to the desire to demonstrate divine favor. These temptations move from the physical to the political to the spiritual, and each one is rejected through an affirmation of obedience to God. Eliot's structure of the tempters clearly echoes this progression, but it also extends it, adding a fourth level that introduces a problem that is not explicitly present in the biblical narrative. The first tempter in Eliot's play corresponds quite closely to the first temptation of Christ. He appeals to Becket's past life, to the pleasures and comforts that he enjoyed as chancellor. He invites Becket to return to a life of ease, to abandon the conflict that lies ahead. This temptation operates at the level of physical and emotional comfort, and like Christ's refusal to turn stones into bread, Becket rejects it without difficulty. This is not because the temptation is trivial, but because it belongs to a stage that Becket has already passed. He has already renounced that life, and therefore the temptation has little hold over him. The second tempter introduces a more complex form of temptation, one that corresponds to the offer of worldly power in the gospel narrative. He suggests that Becket could regain political influence, that he could work with the king, and that through this influence he could achieve good. This is a particularly subtle temptation because it presents itself as morally justified. It is not a temptation to evil, but a temptation to do good through questionable means. In biblical terms, this resonates with the offer of all the kingdoms of the world. But Eliot complicates it by framing it as a temptation to use power for righteous ends. Becket recognizes the danger here, and the pursuit of power, even for good purposes, inevitably involves compromise, and therefore he rejects it. The third tempter corresponds to a different form of worldly engagement, the temptation to oppose power rather than to yield it. He invites Becket to join forces with the barons against the king, to become a leader in a political struggle. This too appears justified because it can be framed as a resistance to injustice. However, Becket recognizes that this is still a form of entanglement in a political sphere, still a form of ambition, and still driven by the logic of power. In rejecting this temptation, Becket moves further away from the world of political action, but he has not yet confronted the deepest problem. It is with the fourth tempter that Eliot departs most significantly from the biblical model. In the gospel narrative, the final temptation involves the idea of spiritual testing, of demonstrating divine favor. Christ is invited to throw himself from the temple, trusting that the angels will save him. This is a temptation to spiritual pride, to the desire to prove one's relationship with God. Eliot transforms this idea into something even more interior and even more difficult: the temptation to desire martyrdom. The fourth tempter does not offer Becket anything external. Instead, he articulates a possibility that lies within Becket himself: the desire to suffer for God, to achieve spiritual glory, to be remembered as a saint. This is what makes it the most dangerous temptation, because it is indistinguishable, at first, from genuine devotion. It appears to be the highest form of virtue, and yet it contains within it the possibility of pride. This is where Eliot introduces a problem that goes beyond the biblical narrative. In the Gospels, Christ rejects the temptation of God, but his motivation is never in question. His obedience is absolute. In Eliot's play, however, Becket must question his own motives. He must ask whether his willingness to face death is truly an act of obedience, or whether it is driven by a desire for recognition, for spiritual distinction. At this point, Becket recognizes that he must relinquish not only worldly desires, but even the desire to achieve spiritual greatness. He must abandon the desire for martyrdom itself. This is an extremely difficult idea, because it suggests that one must act without aiming at any result, without seeking any form of reward, even spiritual reward. It is at this moment that Becket arrives at the central insight of the play, expressed in the line, "The last temptation is the greatest treason, to do the right deed for the wrong reason." This line is not simply a statement, it is a turning point, because it shifts the focus from action to intention, from what is done to why it is done. It suggests that even the most apparently virtuous action may be compromised if it is motivated by the wrong intention. In this sense, Eliot deepens the concept of temptation. In the biblical narrative, temptation is something external, something that presents itself as an alternative to obedience. In Murder in the Cathedral, the most dangerous temptation is internal. It arises not from the external offers, but from the self. It is not the temptation to do wrong, but the temptation to do the right for the wrong reasons. This shift has profound implications because it suggests that the real struggle is not between the different courses of action, but within the self in the realm of intention. It raises the question of whether it is possible to purify one's motives completely, or whether the self is inevitably re-enters even the most sincere actions. In this way, Eliot takes a biblical pattern of temptation and transforms it into a modern problem. He retains the structure, the progression from lower to higher temptations, but he introduces a new level of complexity, one that reflects a more introspective understanding of human motivation. The result of this is that Becket struggles in not only a repetition of Christ's temptation, but an extension of it, a movement into a deeper and more uncertain terrain, where the distinction between right and wrong is no longer sufficient, and where the purity of intention becomes the central concern. Now, let us, just for a moment, turn to the Bhagavad Gita. We encounter a strikingly similar problem in the teaching of Karma Yoga, particularly in the famous verse from chapter 2, verse 47. You have the right to perform your prescribed duty, but you are not entitled to the fruits of action. This teaching is often summarized as the principle of Nishikama Karma, or action without desire for the fruits. Here too, the focus shifts from the external action to the internal disposition of the agent. The Gita does not ask Arjuna to withdraw from action. On the contrary, it insists that he must act. What it asks him to relinquish is not action, but attachment to results, to success, to personal gain. If we think about this carefully, we begin to see the parallel. In both Eliot's play and the Gita, the central problem is not whether to act, but how to act without being governed by the self. In the Gita, Krishna advises Arjuna to perform his duty while remaining detached from the fruits of action, to act without desire, without attachment, and without ego. Similarly, Becket comes to understand that he must act without desiring the outcome, without seeking martyrdom, without even taking satisfaction in the idea of sacrifice. In both cases, the ideal is not inaction, but a form of action that is free from self-interest. However, there is also an important difference, and recognizing this difference deepens our understanding of both the texts. In the Gita, the emphasis is on detachment from the fruits of action, that is, from the results. One must act, but one must not be attached to success or failure. In Eliot's play, the emphasis is even more interior, because the danger lies not only in the attachment to results, but in the intention itself. Becket must not even desire martyrdom as a result, because the desire would already corrupt the act. So while the Gita asks us to give up attachment to the fruits of action, Eliot pushes the problem further inward, asking whether we can give up the desire that shapes the action itself. And yet, at a deeper level, both arrive at a similar insight. In the Gita, Krishna tells Arjuna to act as an instrument, to see himself as part of a larger cosmic order, rather than as an independent agent. In Murder in the Cathedral, Becket speaks of becoming an instrument of God, suggesting that true action is not self-generated, but aligned with a higher will. In both cases, the ideal is not self-assertion, but self-surrender, not withdrawal from action, but a transformation of the way in which action is performed. Having reached this moment in which Becket recognizes that even the desire for martyrdom may be a form of self-assertion, the play does not immediately move towards action, nor does it rush towards the event that we know is coming. Instead, Eliot introduces what may at first appear to be a pause, a suspension of dramatic movement, in the form of the Christmas sermon. However, this moment is not a pause in any simple sense, because it does not interrupt the action of the play. Rather, it provides a framework within which the action may be understood. Without the sermon, the events of Part 2 could easily be interpreted as political conflict or personal tragedy. But with the sermon, those same events acquire a different significance, and it is therefore necessary to dwell at this moment, to consider carefully what Becket is doing as he speaks. The shift from verse to prose is immediately noticeable, and this shift is not merely formal. Throughout the earlier part of the play, verse has allowed Eliot to maintain a certain level of ambiguity, to suggest meanings without fixing them, to create an atmosphere in which ideas can resonate without being fully defined. In the sermon, however, Becket speaks in prose, and this movement towards prose signals a movement towards clarity. It suggests that what is being offered here is not poetic suggestion, but direct explanation, not ambiguity, but definition. Becket begins by referring to the significance of Christmas, to the celebrations of the birth of Christ. And this is a moment traditionally associated with joy, with renewal, and with the idea of divine presence entering the human world. However, almost immediately, he introduces a point that unsettles this sense of simple joy, by reminding the congregation that the Church commemorates the martyrdom of St. Stephen immediately after Christmas. This juxtaposition is not accidental, and Becket insists that it should not be treated as such. The Church, he suggests, does not organize its calendar arbitrarily. Rather, it reveals through its structure a deeper understanding of reality. The proximity of Christmas and martyrdom suggests that joy and suffering are not opposites, but are intimately connected. That the birth of Christ already contains within it the possibility of sacrifice, and that the meaning of one cannot be fully understood without reference to the other. This challenges the way in which we normally organize our experience, because we tend to separate joy from suffering, to see them as distinct and even opposed. Eliot, through Becket, invites us to reconsider this separation, to recognize that what appears to be a joyful moment may contain within it an element of suffering, and that suffering itself may have a meaning that is not immediately apparent. It is within this context that Becket turns to the question of martyrdom, and it is here that the argument of the sermon becomes most precise. He insists that martyrdom is not something that can be chosen, not something that can be willed, and not something that can be pursued as an aim. A Christian martyrdom is not an accident, he says, but he immediately adds that it is not affected by a man's will to become a martyr. This distinction is crucial because it directly addresses the temptation that Becket has just confronted, the temptation to desire martyrdom as a form of spiritual achievement. If martyrdom were something that could be chosen, then it could become an object of desire, something to be pursued, something that might bring recognition or glory. But Becket rejects this possibility entirely. Martyrdom, he insists, is not something that the individual achieves. It is something that occurs as part of a larger design. The martyr does not seek death, he accepts it. He does not act in order to become a martyr. He acts in obedience, and martyrdom is a consequence of that obedience, not its aim. This distinction requires careful attention because it involves a redefinition of action itself. We are accustomed to thinking of action in terms of intention and outcome, as something that begins in the will and is directed towards a goal. Becket makes us understand martyrdom by challenging this model, suggesting that the highest form of action may be one in which the individual relinquishes control over both intention and outcome, in which he acts without seeking to determine the result. This idea is difficult to grasp because it seems to undermine the very basis of action. If one does not act with a goal in mind, then what guides action? Becket's answer is that action is guided not by personal desire, but by alignment with a larger order, an order that the individual does not create, but to which he must respond. In theological terms, this is expressed in the idea that the martyr becomes an instrument, that his action is not self-generated, but participates in something that exceeds him. As Becket speaks, there is a sense that struggle we witnessed earlier has reached a point of resolution. He no longer appears to be conflicted. He does not speak of fear nor of desire. Instead, he speaks with a calmness that suggests acceptance, as if the question that troubled him has been settled. This does not mean that the future is clear or predictable, but it does mean that he has relinquished the need to control it. It is important to recognize that this state is not passivity. Becket does not withdraw from action. Rather, he redefines what action means. He is prepared to act, but he is no longer concerned with the outcome of his action. This is a condition that the sermon establishes, and it is this condition that makes it possible to understand what follows. When we move into part 2, the tone of the play changes, but the underlying tension remains. The arrival of the 4 knights introduces a different mode of speech, a different way of understanding action, and it is important to recognize that Eliot does not present these knights as simple antagonists. They are not villains in any conventional sense. They do not appear as embodiments of evil. On the contrary, they present themselves as rational, reasonable men, acting in accordance with what they believe to be necessary. This is significant because it presents before us a situation that prevents us from interpreting the play in simple and moral terms. If the knights were clearly evil, then the conflict would be straightforward. But Eliot complicates this by allowing the knights to articulate their position in a way which is coherent and persuasive. They accuse Becket of disloyalty, of disrupting the order of the kingdom, of placing his own authority over the king, and from their perspective, these accusations are justified. In this way, the play introduces a tension between 2 different ways of understanding action. On the one hand, there is Becket's understanding, which emphasizes the purification of intention and the surrender of personal will. On the other hand, there is a perspective of the knights, which emphasizes necessity, order, and the practical consequences of action. These 2 perspectives do not simply oppose each other. They operate within different frameworks, and it is precisely this difference that makes the conflict so difficult to resolve. One of the most significant moments of Part 2 occurs when the priests attempt to close the doors of the cathedral. Faced with the threat posed by the knights, they seek to protect Becket by turning the cathedral into a place of refuge. This response is entirely understandable, and in many ways it appears to be the sensible course of action: to preserve life, to prevent violence, to avoid unnecessary suffering. These are the goals that we would normally consider to be desirable. However, Becket refuses to allow the doors to be closed, and this refusal is central to the meaning of the play. It is not simply an act of courage, nor is it a gesture of defiance. It is a decision that arises from the position he has reached, from his understanding of action as something that must not be governed by fear or by the desire to control outcomes. To close the doors would be to act out of fear, to attempt to preserve life, and in doing so, to reintroduce the very element of self-interest that he has sought to relinquish. Becket's insistence that the doors remain open is therefore a continuation of the process that began within the rejection of the fourth tempter. He does not seek the death, but he does not seek to avoid it. He refuses to make his action dependent on the outcome, and in doing so, he maintains the purity of intention that he has struggled to achieve. The murder itself occurs with a suddenness that is striking, particularly after the slow unfolding of the earlier parts of the play. There is no prolonged struggle, no dramatic resistance, no attempt to escape. This lack of theatrical emphasis is deliberate, because Eliot is not interested in presenting the murder as a spectacle. The significance of the event lies not in its physical execution, but in its meaning. It is after the murder, however, that Eliot introduces one of the most radical elements of the play. The knights step forward and address the audience directly, and in doing so, they break the dramatic frame. The use of prose in their speeches reinforces this shift, creating a sense that we have moved from the world of the play into the world of the audience. We are no longer observers of a historical event. We are participants in a process of judgment. The speeches of the knights are not expressions of remorse or confession. They are carefully constructed arguments designed to justify their actions. Each knight presents a slightly different perspective, but all of them share a common approach, which is to frame the murder as a necessary act carried out in the interest of order and stability. They insist that they acted without any personal motive, that they were not driven by hatred, but by duty. This sense, or the absence of personal motive, is particularly significant because it echoes the concern that lies in the heart of the play, the question of intention. The knights claim that their actions were not motivated by self-interest, and in doing so, they present themselves as acting in a way that superficially at least resembles the ideal that Becket has been striving to achieve. However, the nature of the action, the fact that it involves violence, forces us to question whether intention alone is sufficient to justify an action. One of the most unsettling aspects of the speeches is the suggestion that Becket himself is responsible for his death, that by accepting the possibility of martyrdom, he created the conditions in which his murder became inevitable. This argument is disturbing because it raises the possibility that Becket's actions may not be entirely free from self-interest, that his acceptance of martyrdom may be interpreted as a form of desire rather than an action of surrender. Eliot does not resolve this ambiguity. He does not provide a clear answer, nor does he instruct the audience on how to interpret the knights' argument. Instead, he leaves us in a position of uncertainty, forcing us to confront the difficulty of judging human actions. particularly when motives are complex and not fully accessible. The chorus, which is at the beginning of the play, expressing fear and a desire to avoid involvement, undergoes a transformation response to the murder. Their language becomes more intense, reflecting their attempt to comprehend the significance of what has occurred. They speak of pollution, of corruption, of a world that has been disturbed by violence. And yet, as they continue to reflect, their understanding begins to shift. Gradually, they move towards a recognition that Becket's death is not merely an act of violence, but something that carries a deeper significance. In their final hymn, they give thanks to the blood of thy martyrs. He recognizes that it is a source of renewal. This transformation is not simple or immediate. It involves a movement from confusion and fear towards a more complex understanding. In the end, the play does not provide a resolution in the conventional sense. It does not offer a clear moral lesson, nor does it resolve the tensions that it has created. Instead, it leaves us with a set of questions that remain open. It asks us to consider whether it is possible to act without being influenced by self-interest, whether the purity of intention can ever be fully achieved, and whether we can truly understand the motives that guide our actions. By focusing on the problem of intention, Eliot shifts our attention away from the external events and towards the internal processes that shape them. In doing so, he transforms a historical narrative into a meditation on the human condition, inviting us to examine not only the actions of Becket, but our own actions and the intentions that lie behind them. As we come to the end of this exploration, it is worth pausing for a moment, not to arrive at a final conclusion, but to return to the question with which we began. If it is possible to do the right thing for the wrong reason, then the problem of action becomes far more complex than we might have imagined, because it is no longer enough to ask whether something is right or wrong. We must also ask why it is done, and whether we can ever fully know the answer to the question. Eliot does not resolve this difficulty for us. Instead, he leaves us with a deeper awareness of it, inviting us to look not only at Becket, but at ourselves, at the ways in which our own actions may be shaped by motives that remain partially hidden. If you found this exploration meaningful, you may find it valuable to continue engaging with texts in this way, not simply for examination, but as a way of thinking more deeply about literature and about the question it raises. If you would like to explore more such discussions, you may consider subscribing to the channel, where we will continue to engage with literary works in a similarly reflective and detailed manner. Stay tuned for more such stories on literature.